Today is a very, very important subject that we are discussing. Okay. Why do people lose their way? I think is very, very important. And today is a great opportunity to discuss this. So my question to all of you, and Shreya, if you can open the chat box, please. Why do teams turn toxic? Okay. All of us have worked in different kinds of teams. And for some strange reason, teams turn extremely toxic. What could be the reason why teams turn toxic? I'm not talking of people, but why do teams turn toxic? That's my question. Niti, we invariably get some very, very interesting answers from the participants. So if the chat box is open, then let's hear you guys tell us about why do teams turn toxic? And we'd love to hear from you guys. So Gayatri says lack of passion or drive. Fantastic. Very nice, Gayatri ji. Shreya says no transparency. All right, that's interesting. Let me call out. Let's see what answers are we going to get today. Why do teams turn toxic? What could be the reason why teams turn toxic? And is there anything that we can do about it? Okay, that's the point that we're going to be talking with Niti a little later. But let's hear it from let's hear some more answers from you people. Mesh, Stephen, Vinayak weighs in with ego and jealousy. Absolutely, Vinayak. Very interesting answer. If I can get Dheeraj or Narendra Singh or Ajish. Dheeraj says lack of clear rules and expectations. Fantastic. Stephen says not value driven. Absolutely, Stephen. That's a great point. Not value driven. Dinesh says manager as leader of team may be creating the toxicity. Very interesting, Dinesh. Ajish says no respect for team members. All right. That's an interesting answer, Ajish. Anybody else weighing in with an answer? We'll give another 30 seconds and then close the chat box. But I think they're very, very interesting. Ego, jealousy, lack of clear roles, no transparency, lack of passion or drive, no respect, lack of clarity on goals. Okay. Anything else? Great. I think we've got some very interesting answers and we'll work around this today. I promise you that today is going to be a very, very interesting session. Narendra Singh says lack of clarity. Shreya says no transparency. Get teams or individuals to collaborate and work together. Sure, Shreya. So let's just shut the chat box for some time so that we can all focus. Today is going to be interesting. So there is something called a downward spiral. The interesting thing about this entire Antar Prerana series is the fact that we are introduced to some very, very interesting qualities. Okay, we are introduced to some very, very interesting thoughts. Okay. So the first thing that, as founders, as people who are running startups, we need to be careful about is to avoid the downward spiral. Okay. And this downward spiral is something that is so very critical. I'm sure Niti and Dipti will share with us through their long years of experience how organizations with great promise, with people who started off in a very, very interesting, very positive, very let's say textbook style correct way, just lost their way somewhere. And this is something that has been troubling me for the last so many years and there are countless examples. And I don't think it's right for us to give names out here, but all of you are seeing day in and day out, for instance, how organizations that were really, really defining markets, okay, who were setting the pace, who were setting the standard, as it were, suddenly seem to have lost their way. Okay. And, there are so many categories, category after category after category, whether it's a consumer product company, whether it is a fintech company, whether it is an edtech company, any kind of a company, whether it is a spirits company, whether it is an airline that we're talking about. Suddenly these great organizations, seemingly great organizations, just seem to have lost their way. And why would that happen? So there are some very interesting insights that we can learn, okay, from our ancient thought processes. So the first thing is that we are taught something interesting, that if you have three types of people, okay, uh, what kind of people? First is somebody who's very deceitful, who's very hypocritical, somebody who we call Damba. Now, here is someone who's very hypocritical, very deceitful, like you guys put in the chat box. Okay. Now, this is someone that you've got to be very, very careful about. Okay. Two, somebody who's very arrogant, very haughty. Okay. You may be proud of what you're doing, but if you start believing that you are the only person who's always right, and you have this sense of entitlement, you put others down, then you have a challenge in the entire team. Okay. And the third is something called abhimana, which is pride, self-conceit, that you believe that you're bigger than the rest of the team. Now, if you have these three qualities in any human being, and if they're part of the team, and, God forbid, if this is a person who's the leader of that team, then you are setting yourself up in terms of extreme trouble. Okay. And this is a team that turns extremely toxic very, very quickly. Okay. Because you stop listening to people. You stop being open to what are the possibilities of what can happen. And I've seen in my life that, whenever you've got people working like this, when you've got individuals working like this, then those are teams that turn extremely toxic. Very, very gradually, you get to a situation where team members who want to contribute, who can make a difference, just stop making that contribution. And they're just hanging in there, and they're just biding time, and they're just whiling away time when things are going wrong. Rudeness. I've always wondered, why are people so rude? There's no need to be rude. No, there's no, I mean, you can be demanding, but why should you be rude? There's no need to be rude, with the way you treat people and the way you handle people. Okay. So what happens in this? Let me tell you. And here is the greatness of this thought, that so many thousands of years ago we were made aware of what are the characteristics of this team, of these people who work in a team, and what do they do to a team. First of all, they are people who are not happy. These teams are not happy at all. Okay, so we call them kamashrita. So these are guys who are just not happy. Whatever happens, there is just zero happiness in the team. Okay, anything good happens, there's always an explanation as to why this has happened or why something like this is going on. Okay, these people are known as dushpuram, which means they're endless amount of wants. Okay, they're all the time complaining. Ye nahi hai, wo nahi hai, this is not there, that is not there. They're all the time looking for faults. They're complaining at any given point of time. They're all the time complaining. And, as Dipti, Niti, and I, as people who are service providers, we can instantaneously think of people like this who are just not happy, who are all the time complaining. Okay, you do something, they're saying, theek hai, but, this. They're people who are very damba, which is very arrogant. Okay, and these are people who are, let's say, so arrogant that they forget that it is the people that they have that deliver the results that they want. Okay, it is that arrogance that brings it down. Then you get into something called mana, which is hypocrisy, false, behaviors, being completely hypocritical of whatever is going on around you. There's a lot of mother anvita, which means there's a lot of pride. I am the only right person in this entire team. There's nobody else who's right in this entire organization at this point of time. Then there is something called mohat, which is being extremely delusive. These are people who are delusive. There's just no realism in them. They're not going to be realistic. Next quarter is going to get better. I know. Why? Because I'm saying it's going to get better. Or these are people who are looking for instant gratification. And this is something that, this is grihitva asat grahan, which means immediate, instant gratification is what they're looking for all the time. Okay. And finally, they are mediocre. There's a lot of mediocrity, asuchi, okay, vrata, which is they're just too mediocre. The whole team turns into a mediocre bench. So, what could be the reason why a startup can hurtle into this downward spiral? Is what we're going to be examining today. And we've chosen a very interesting shloka for you. And I'm going to request Dipti to share with us that particular shloka. And then we're going to examine that shloka in greater detail and then bring Niti in from her extensive practice. I mean, both Dipti and Niti have spent a number of years as to why is it that a entrepreneur who starts out absolutely right just goes and gets lost. Because we need to understand that we've been exploring dharma and artha, and today we're looking at kama. Kama is good. Like last week, we said you can't have nishkama karma. It is an oxymoron. Uh, without kama, without desire, you can't have any creation of wealth. But then at what point of time is that thin line going to get breached from a desire that wants to create wealth in the right way and from a karma that goes completely uncontrolled and makes you go awry, makes you go all over the country, all over the place. So we're going to explore this because this is, I think, something very important uh, for all of us to understand as to at what point of time this entire desire goes into a tailspin and puts you onto a downward spiral. So we've chosen a very interesting shloka, and I'm going to request Dipti to help us with understanding this particular shloka and figuring out uh, how we can use this shloka to understand what we need to be doing. So this is chapter 16, verse 21. Yes, Dipti.
त्रिविधं नरकस्येदं द्वारं नाशनमात्मनः कामक्रोध तथा लोभ तस्मात् एतत्त्रयं त्यजेत्. Kam, Krodh. These are the three gates leading to the hell of destruction for the soul: lust, anger, and greed. Therefore, one should abandon all three. Kam, as in this shloka mentions, as Ram said very rightly, that we need desire, right? Without desire, there is no action. In fact, I believe that desire is the factor that motivates you into action because you want to achieve whatever you desire. So there, it is a motivator. But from this shloka, what we need to look at it is that it is the irrational desire that can create a problem. Okay. And especially whenever we have a desire, we need to look at what is the intention behind this desire. And therefore, we come back to what we already started in the earlier sessions, is why we are doing what we are doing. Yeah. So this is the fact that we need to remember when we look at this shloka from a calm perspective, that kama, desire, is good. Per se, it is not good. Only when it becomes an unethical that it creates a problem. So if the desire is unethical, then it definitely leads to vinasha. So what do we do as entrepreneurs? I find that these three lust, which is the desire, anger, and greed, which are the three, you can say, vices that uh, brings a downfall, because there are several ones: kama, krodha, moha, lobha, mat, machari, right? Of these three, because the calm is the one which it starts with calm, the desire. So when that is happens, as entrepreneurs, what we need to do is what I'm going to look at, and which I believe works. You know, if it is calm and if the intention is unethical, then we need to do self-reflection, introspection on what we are doing, yeah, and why we are doing. So it's kind of a remedy that you can look at it as. When we are in anger, especially when there is a calm, that is desire. Desire leads to greed, which is accumulation of wealth. And when that there are obstacles when we are trying to achieve, obviously there are going to be problems, there are going to be obstacles, which may lead to frustration and anger. Now, so to deal with the anger, one needs to practice acceptance and empathy. And the greed, how do we look at that? Is, I believe that greed can be addressed by sharing of wealth, by practicing win-win principle. Yeah. In fact, even if a startup, which need not be a big with lots of employees, maybe just 2 or 3 people, also we need to have a CSR activity. I do remember that in my organization, we believe that everything is not egocentric, because it is from that where all these greed, moh, mats, everything comes from that. And if that is so, then how do we move from I to we? And that is what we also help organizations to move from I to we. And I don't want to give you an example of the organization that would have gone spiraling down, but what I would like to hear share is, um, in few organizations, what we have tried is that the team, especially the team that was going through the program, the mid-level managers, we motivated them to do a CSR activity and do a workshop with the underprivileged children on confidence building. Now, here we were trying to motivate them and help them in their work area, building their confidence. We in turn trained them to help the children to build confidence, which worked win-win, because in the process, not only they were building their own confidence, but they were also helping the children of the underprivileged children to build their confidence. So it worked wonderfully in this. So sharing of wealth, when we are talking of coming out of greed, sharing of wealth, and when I say wealth, it does not just mean money. Whatever is your wealth, it could be time, it could be talent, it could be knowledge, because these days I find that people, even at the top level, are not willing to share knowledge because they feel that they would become redundant. So knowledge sharing itself is a big problem within the company. So if you can do that, that can go a long way in addressing these issues. Yes, over to you, Ram.
Wonderful. So there's a beautiful, you know, uh, point here that we're talking about. That these six, I mean, we're talking of three here, but there are actually about six gateways to hell, as we call them: Kama, Krodha, Moha, Mada, Matsarya. Kama, Krodha, Lobha, Moha, Mada, Matsarya. Okay. The whole point about this is very interesting. So, where is this downward spiral coming from, and what is the thought there? The point is that when we are obsessed with the results that may happen later, okay, it leads to some kind of an attachment. Okay. It says dhyana vishayan sangaha, which means you get into a situation where you get completely attached to a future result. And it is that overthinking on that, that we're going to be $1 billion company or whatever it is that you guys want to become. That leads to a certain attachment. And that, if you overthink on that future result, that will happen. I mean, all of us who are working hard, and why not? I mean, everybody wants to be $1 billion company. Why nothing wrong with that. And we should aspire to be $1 billion company. Okay. But when you overthink of when I get to becoming a $1 billion company valuation, that leads to a certain amount of attachment to what? Not to the fact that I'm going to be a billion-dollar company. We recently saw a very, very interesting market leader, for instance, moving from a situation of being a category defining company just because of this valuation game going completely awry. And it is that desire. Now, when that desire, okay, when that attachment to what? To the fact that I want to be the category defining person, I want to be the biggest company in my category, I want to be X billion dollars, etc., etc. That attachment to that thought leads to a lot of desire, karma. When this becomes completely unfulfilled, that will get to anger. Okay. And they said kama abhijyate krodha, which means you're going to get into that anger situation. Now, what happens with anger? Anger, if it is directed well, it's good. But anger can create some amount of confusion. Because what anger does is that it creates ignorance, it creates confusion. You stop listening to the rest of the world because you're so angry because something is not happening. And you open yourself up to taking inputs from a whole host of people. And when you get into that state of confusion, guess what happens? You lose the power of discrimination. And when you lose that power of discrimination, he says, sammohat smriti vibranti. When you lose that power of discrimination, guess what happens? Your buddhi gets into nasha. And when your buddhi goes for a 6, when your intellect goes for a 6, when your ability to discriminate, your ability to decide goes for a 6, guess what happens? Everything but everything is lost. So this is the downward spiral that we've been taught about. When teams are getting to be toxic, and when teams are, operating in those areas that I talked about earlier, and they get on to this entire downward spiral, guess what happens? That team is just going down and down and down and down and down. And it is so sad when you see perfectly decent organizations going through this. In Bangalore itself, we've seen so many organizations walk through this route. And I'm 100% sure all of you are aware of this. So what do we need to do? We need to get back, as Dipti said, to that purpose. If there is a certain amount of toxicity in that team, which is being caused by this entire gratification ball game, then we need to pull back as entrepreneurs. We need to make sure that you avoid these 6 gateways to hell. Because only and only when you avoid these 6 gateways to hell will you create an organization that is lasting. I'd like to invite Neeti to weigh in here because I'm sure she's got enough and more of experience in this. I have been a great admirer of the company that she runs, Team Lease, and I've seen it grow literally from its infancy to where it is, become a market leader, a category-defining leader today in the country, forget the country, across the world. And Neeti, lovely having you on the program. Would love to have you weigh in on why do teams turn toxic and where is this downward spiral that they get into? What are some early things that we can recognize? So if you can tell us a little about Team Lease itself, Neeti, and then we can talk. Neeti?
Yeah. So, the question that you asked, and everyone gave multiple answers. If I have to check them off, my answer would be all of the above.
Yeah.
It's a combination of multiple things, right? But one more thing that I would add here is, if the founder's goals and the team's goals are misaligned, that's one of the other reasons why toxicity kind of seeps in. Okay. So, okay, like I called out about our organization, we are about 2,000 odd core headcount.
company. And of course, we also have people leaving us. We also have lots of new people coming in. That's the way it is. But interestingly, we are a 24-year-old organization, and we have about 10% of our core headcount celebrating 20 years or 15 years in the organization.
Wow.
So I think that's something we're doing right. Obviously there are lots of things that we go wrong and we learn on the way, but there's something we keep doing right. We bring in a lot of leaders from the industry, but we also realize that what brought us to probably the first 10 years is not going to take us for the next 100 years. So we bring in more leaders, we bring in more talent. And one thing that we realized very, very early on, and this is true for every startup, every entrepreneur, is that while we look at diversity and everyone keeps talking about DEI, cognitive diversity is very important. Of course, you do genders and you do other kind of diversity, but if we don't have cognitive diversity, I think entrepreneurs fail. Secondly, I have seen this and I think it works extremely well is how do we have a conscious mind, whether it's a co-founder, whether it is a team member, whether it is a leader next to you, or it is somebody who's your mentor or your spouse, somebody who's there to show you the mirror. Because with the kind of pressures that founders work in, it's very easy to be in your own thinking process and your own shell. So if there's nobody telling you right versus wrong, or if you have leaders, in your own team telling you right versus wrong, I think it kind of works quite well. But just somebody who's showing the hard facts, saying, "Hey, this is not going to work. Hey, this is what I'm." You see, you ask for science. You see early attrition with great leaders. Nobody wants to stay in a company, and we see this. You obviously didn't call out names, but many of those organizations, people have not stayed beyond 3 months, 4 months, 1 year max. And those people have been superbly successful in other industries doing great work. So why? And this is a pattern. So I think you recognize those patterns saying people are not sticking along because there's something wrong with the organization. Right? Or, my goals are not what the organization goals are. I think as leaders, we have to start thinking on those lines because if I want to go A and the company is wanting to go A into 10, it's not going to work. And it's also very clear, as founders, as entrepreneurs, the pressure is so much. We end up working maybe 24/7 or more. But then the expectation that everybody else starts working for that long is unfair. People do work those hours because it's interesting. They're doing great job. They're doing research. They're doing innovation. They're learning. Till then, it's all okay. But the moment the organization gets to a certain, run rate, then expecting every employee to work the additional hours is not going to happen.
Yeah.
So we've seen people say, hey, you know what, I'm burning. I don't think it's going to work for me. And it's not about the stage of life. I mean, today, if you bring in a youngster into workforce, they don't want to work even 9 hours a day. But they will achieve what probably we are achieving in 9 to 10 hours in 5 hours time frame, which is fine. As long as the outcome and the impact is there. I guess we all have to become become flexible. Right? So it's not about just putting the number of hours, it's about what value you're bringing to the table. And today's youngsters are actually just talking about impact and value. They're not going to talk about, hey, I'm going to sit in front of you for 12 hours, so get me a promotion. So I guess various things add up, what kind of people we are bringing in, where do they come from? What is their primary goal? What is the organization's goal? Like I called out initially, for us, it was about putting India to work. So if I have to give employment opportunities, I have to do a lot of counseling, hand-holding, what do I call, rejecting a lot more candidates than hiring. So, if I'm rejecting, why am I rejecting? Where do they go? What happens next? I think there are so many questions that come to us. But in a way, that's a company problem and not an individual employee problem, I would call it. So I don't want to leave everything onto the employee. I want to call it as part of my game plan, as part of my strategy. And then each person in the value chain kind of does what he or she is expected to do. keeping it together, communicating what we want to do, and which is why for us that motto of putting India to work is universal. If nothing else, TeamLease will be known as a staffing company, one of the largest staffing companies, who kind of set the staffing industry in the country.
Absolutely.
And that's common, that's uniform for everyone who's working with us or has ever worked with us in the past. So there's something that kind of binds you together, and we've seen that work very well for us as a company. So I'll pause here and take it.
Wonderful. But I have a question to you, Niti. When some of these organizations, you, as a staffing company, do you also get into some kind of a counseling of the leadership in terms of what should they be doing? I mean, some of these points that you mentioned are so true. I will not work beyond 9 hours. I mean, that's the way of life. I will not work on a weekend. These are. I mean, this is something that was. I mean, if we even thought about it, it was sacrilege, right? How can you even think of something like that? Correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what happens when, how do you work with some of the organizations that you consult with or you help with?
Yeah, so what happens is when companies tell us saying, hey, you know what, I want 20 people with certain skill sets. These are the timings, this is the rates that I'm going to pay them. We work backwards with them saying, you want this segment of candidates. We will not be able to get you someone who's so typically today, if I'm hiring Ram, the first question candidates ask us is, what's the mode of working? Is it all 5 days in office? Is it all remote, or is it hybrid? The moment I say 5 days in office, there's a filter in their head and they kind of exit my database. So I think we have to go back to customers and say, you will not get great candidates if this is what you're stuck to. And why is that? That's because somebody else in the industry is giving them the flexibility. If all of us, and if I think if the same situation was before COVID, this question was not even on the table.
Exactly.
It was a given, but situations changed. The way of working has changed. The world of work has changed. So if that has changed, I think customers or employers also have to relook at their own policies. And it's not like they will not get candidates. They will, but I think the cycle time will be longer. They may have to pay higher, or they may have to probably downgrade their expectations a little bit. Because the best of the breeds, they come in with their own nuances and their own asks on the table. So we do go back saying, if you're hiring from, let's say, how do I call it? If you're hiring from a tier 2 city, your candidate expectations are very different. So we go back to employers and say, this is what you probably could do or should do. But if you're hiring from a Bangalore, when nobody wants to travel for 2 to 3 hours just to get to office, right? Then the way of hiring, the model of working is very, very different. The salaries they get are very different. And from what kind of organizations I'm hiring them. In Bangalore, if I have to just look at, where we are, all of us are, a lot of tech talent gets hired from startups. Because founders are doing great work on deep tech, innovation, research. Now, these employees are actually used to all flexibility as long as they get the outcome and impact for the startup. But if I have to hire them for a Fortune 500 company, there are boundaries that an employee has to work on. That becomes very difficult. So we have to counsel the employee as well as the employer, if I'm answering your question.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, I just want to, I just want to tell our participants today one thing. So like this downward spiral, you can very easily arrest it and then figure how you can get onto an upward spiral. So how do you do that is something that I'd like to address. Okay. So the first and the most important thing is that thought, like Dipti mentioned, CSR was one particular example that we're talking about, or like Niti mentioned, outcomes are very important rather than the effort. I mean, you focus on the outcome. Now, if you were to get those thoughts, if you as a founder were to get that thought, that positive thought, that positive intent, move away from that toxicity kind of a situation into a more enabling kind of a thought, then guess what will happen? That thought can then put you into an upward spiral, because those thoughts, those guided thoughts, will help you take that kind of karma, that kind of action, okay, which is significant action. And once you get into that, and that significant action keeps getting repeated again and again and again, and this is something that we keep telling our customers too, that you keep making sure that that significant action is repeated. Whatever is the significant action that a team member or a team is doing must be repeated till it becomes a habit. Once it becomes a habit and it becomes a practice within the organization, then guess what? That becomes the character of the entire enterprise. And once that becomes the character of the enterprise, you will start getting results that are far more than what you thought you could get. So it isn't wrong to think that you want to become a billion-dollar company. But the way to get to becoming a billion-dollar company is more important than to get into this anger, uh, greed, attachment, jealousy, etc., and creating a downward spiral. So the same thing can be reversed, and you can get into a beautiful upward spiral. Get the right thinking, get the right action, make sure that it is repeated again and again. Whatever be that action that makes sense to you, keep repeating that action again and again and again. And that action, make it into a habit. Because when it becomes a habit and becomes the character of the enterprise, you will get those results that you want. And when you get those results, guess what? You will actually be creating a lot of joy at work. You will be creating a lot of happiness at work. And it is that happiness that will lead to further enabling thoughts. And that spiral then continues onto an upward curve. Lovely. Niti, what was the experience, Niti, in the room?
So I guess great, because Dr. Gayatri was with me and we were just discussing their industry is very different, their challenges, smaller teams, but they work with such niche domain experts, and in even in a small team, the whole aspect of insecurity, jealousy kicking in, and you can't do cross-functional changes. You can't, take them from one role to the other role. So what do you do? I mean, of course, like we were discussing, over communication is never a bad thing. So the more we communicate, the better it is for everyone. And personally, I always follow three things as far as teams are concerned. Is I call it CET. It's communication, empowerment, and transparency. If we follow these three with the teams, I guess most of the times, I think it kind of sorts the problems that we land ourselves into.